The opening hook and the ending are unchanged. The structure and all rules hold. Final length lands at about 5,010 words. A suitcase hit the porch and burst open. Clothes spilled across the wet boards. A second suitcase landed beside it, then a cardboard box, then a hissing tabby cat that bolted under the railing. A hand shoved her hard between the shoulder blades. She stumbled down 2 steps and grabbed the post to keep from falling. The door slammed behind her. The lock turned. She stood in the cold with everything she owned scattered at her feet. 68 years old, 11 years of rent paid on time, and now a stranger owned the key. Her name was Marion Vance. She had no children to call. She had no money for a room. She had a cat, 2 suitcases, and nowhere left to go. What Marion found 3 days later, under a floorboard in a building she bought for $1, would change everything. Stay with me on this one. Cedar Junction had been dying for 40 years, and everybody in town knew the exact day it started. That was the day the railroad stopped pulling into the station and the trains just rolled through without slowing down. The storefronts emptied out after that. The young people left. What stayed behind were the old folks and the buildings nobody wanted. Marion Vance was one of those old folks now. She hadn't planned it that way. Nobody ever does. She and her husband Walt had come to Cedar Junction years back because the rent was cheap and the air was dry, and Walt's lungs needed dry air. They rented 2 little rooms above the old hardware store from a man named Guthrie. 11 years they lived up there. Then one winter Walt died in his sleep, quiet, no fuss, the way he'd lived. And Marion kept paying the rent alone on a widow's pension that got a little smaller every single year. And it did get smaller. That's the part people don't understand until it happens to them. The pension stayed the same number on the check, but the world around it kept getting more expensive, so every year that same number bought a little less heat, a little less food. She learned to eat the cheap things. She learned to wear her coat indoors. She learned to smile at the mailman so nobody would guess how thin it had gotten. Then old Guthrie died too. His son inherited the building, and the son lived down in Denver and didn't want tenants. He wanted to sell. And a widow who was 2 months behind was just a problem standing in his way. He sent a man with papers, and then he sent a man with muscle, and that was that. So there she was on the courthouse steps the next morning, because honestly she didn't know where else to go. Dobbin was in a pet carrier at her feet, growling low at every stranger who passed. Her suitcases leaned against the stone wall. She'd spent the night in the bus shelter and her back was screaming, and her pride was somewhere down around her ankles. Nobody looked at her too long. That's a thing you learn about being old and poor at the same time. People look away from you, like your bad luck might be catching. Now here's where it turns. There was a little crowd gathering by the courthouse doors. A man in shirt sleeves came out with a clipboard and started reading off a list in that bored government voice. County surplus, he called it. Properties the county had seized for back taxes and couldn't unload. He read them off one by one, and one by one nobody bid. A gravel lot, a collapsed barn, a well nobody could find anymore. Then he said, Lot 14. The old telephone exchange on Depot Street, Switchboard building, been shuttered since the 60s. He looked up, not expecting anything. Opening bid is $1. Somebody's got to take it off our books. Nobody moved. People chuckled. $1 for a building, and still nobody wanted it, because in a town like Cedar Junction a building was just a tax bill with a roof. Marion didn't decide to do it. That's the honest truth. Her hand went up before her brain caught on. Maybe it was the cold. Maybe it was that she'd slept in a bus shelter and the idea of 4 walls, any 4 walls, sounded like heaven. Maybe it was something else, something she couldn't have named that morning. $1, she said. Her voice came out thin. The man blinked at her. The little crowd turned to look, and you could feel them all thinking the same thing. There's that poor widow they threw out yesterday. Now she's buying a haunted phone building for $1. Anybody else? The man said. Nobody. Sold to the lady with the cat. She paid him with a crumpled bill from the bottom of her purse, one of maybe 6 she had left in the world. He gave her a receipt and a key on a rusted ring, an old iron key, heavy, warm from his pocket. He told her where Depot Street was, though she already knew. Everybody knew. It was the street the whole town had grown up around and then forgotten. Marion carried her suitcases 4 blocks with Dobbin's carrier banging against her knee. She had to stop twice to rest, once on a bench, once against a lamppost, breathing hard, telling herself she only had to make it 1 more block. And she stood in front of the building she now owned. It was a squat brick thing with tall, dusty windows and a faded sign you could barely read. Cedar Junction Telephone Exchange. The door stuck when she pushed it, then gave all at once, and a wall of stale air rolled out at her, 40 years of dust and silence. Inside, it was one long room, a counter along one side. And against the far wall, under the biggest window, the switchboard itself. A great tall panel of black sockets and dead cords and little labeled keys, the kind of machine a person used to sit in front of all day, connecting one voice to another. There was a wooden operator's chair pushed in neat, like whoever sat there had only stepped out for a minute and meant to come right back. Marion set down her cat. She set down her suitcases, and she thought, well, it isn't much. But it's mine, and no man alive can throw me out of it. She had no idea how wrong that last part was going to turn out to be. That first afternoon she just cleaned. What else was there to do? She found a broom that still worked and a bucket under the counter, and she filled it from a spigot out back that groaned and spat rust, and then finally ran clear. She swept 40 years of dust into a gray hill by the door. She wiped down the counter. She talked to Dobbin the whole time, the way lonely people talk to their animals, telling him this wasn't so bad, telling him they'd manage, telling him Walt would have laughed himself silly to see her sweeping out a telephone office at her age. And the strange thing was, the more she cleaned, the more the room started to feel less like a ruin and more like it had been waiting for her. Under the dust, the floor was good hardwood. The counter was solid oak. Whoever had built this place had built it to last, and whoever had left it careful, everything squared away, everything in its place like they'd expected to come back. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt kept. By evening her arms ached and her knees had given up, but the place looked less like a tomb and more like a room. She'd found an old cot folded behind the counter and a camp stove that still had fuel and a lantern with oil in it. Small mercies. She set the cot up near the switchboard and boiled water for tea and thought, for the first time in 2 days, that she might actually sleep. That's when Dobbin started at the floor. He was an old cat, arthritic, slow, not much for games anymore. But he was down near the operator's chair with his ears flat, pawing at a board and making a sound low in his throat that she'd never heard from him before. Marion told him to hush and leave it. He didn't. He pawed harder, hooking his claws into the seam of the wood, pulling. She got down on her aching knees to see what had him so worked up. Probably a mouse, she figured. Probably a nest of them under there. But it wasn't a mouse. One of the floorboards was warped and lifted at the end, just slightly, just enough that a determined old cat could get a claw under it. And when Marion pressed on the other end, the whole board rocked, loose, not nailed down like the rest. Her heart did something funny in her chest. She got her fingers into the gap and she pulled. The board came up with a dry crack. Underneath, in the dark cavity between the floor and the earth, sat a tin strongbox, gray with dust, with a small lock on the front. And beside it, wrapped in oilcloth to keep the damp out, a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. Marion sat back on her heels. Her hands were shaking and she didn't know why yet. She lifted the bundle out careful, like it might crumble. She untied the ribbon. She held the top letter up to the lantern light. and she stopped breathing, because the envelope in beautiful old-fashioned handwriting, brown ink gone soft with age, was addressed to a person by name. It said, "For Marion." She told herself it was a coincidence. Marion was a common enough name once. She turned the letter over, looking for a date, and she found one on the back flap where the writer had noted it. And the date on that letter was more than 70 years old. It was written years before Marion Vance was ever born. She sat there on the cold floor of a building she'd owned for 6 hours, holding a letter with her own name on it, written by a hand that was dust long before she drew her first breath. Dobbin climbed into her lap and she didn't even notice. She opened it. The paper was brittle and she was terrified it would tear, so she worked it loose slow. Inside was a single page, and the handwriting was the same brown ink, careful and slanted, a schoolteacher's hand. "My dear Marion," it began, "if you are reading this, then you have come home at last, and I have waited a very long time for you. My name is Cora Aldridge. I was the night operator at this exchange for 31 years, and you, child, are the reason I kept every secret I ever kept." Marion read it twice, then 3 times, Cora Aldridge. She had never heard the name in her life. Her own mother had almost never spoken of family. Marion had grown up thinking she came from nobody and nowhere, a woman with no roots and no people, and she'd made a kind of peace with that a long time ago, or she'd told herself she had. But there's a difference between making peace with a thing and just going numb to it. She'd spent her whole life not asking, because asking hurt, and now here was a stranger's hand reaching up through 70 years to answer a question she'd been too afraid to ask out loud. The letter went on. It talked about the switchboard, about the long nights, about a war and a train and a promise. It talked in half-riddles, the way people do when they're afraid the wrong person might read their words. And it ended with a line that Marion would remember for the rest of her life. "The rest is under the floor, where the cat sleeps warmest. Lift the second board, and forgive me, child, for what I could not do while I lived." The cat sleeps warmest. Marion looked down at Dobbin, curled in her lap right over the very spot he'd been pawing at. There was more. There was a second board, but Marion was 68 and she was bone-tired and her hands would not stop shaking. She decided the second board could wait until morning. She had waited her whole life to learn she came from somebody. One more night wouldn't hurt, so she boiled her tea. She sat in the old operator's chair, Cora's chair, and it fit her like it had been waiting for her all along. She read the letter one more time by lantern light. Dobbin hopped up and pressed against her side, purring that rusty old purr. Outside, the wind moved through the dead street, and inside it was warm and quiet and hers. For the first time since that door slammed in her face, Marion felt like she could breathe. She had a roof over her head, she had a name. She had a mystery to unravel slow over long peaceful nights. She thought the hard part was behind her. She was wrong. Headlights swept across the tall windows. Marion sat up. A car had pulled to the curb outside, big and dark and expensive, the kind of car that had no business on Depot Street after dark. A door thudded. Boots on the walk. And then a fist knocked on the glass, 3 sharp raps, hard enough to rattle the pane. She tucked the letter into her cardigan before she opened the door. The man on the step wore a long wool coat and a smile that never reached his eyes. He had a leather folder under one arm. Behind him, a second man waited by the car, just standing there watching. "Mrs. Vance," the man in the coat said, and it chilled her that he knew her name. "I'm sorry to call so late. My name is DeLand. I represent Cascade Ridge Partners." He glanced past her into the room and his eyes went straight to the switchboard and stayed there a second too long. "I'm afraid there's been a mistake with your purchase today. A clerical error. This building was already under contract to my clients. The county had no right to auction it." And just like that, the whole story changed. An hour ago this was about a lonely widow and an old mystery. Now it was about a company. A company with lawyers and money and a man standing by a car in the dark. This wasn't Guthrie's son anymore, some cheapskate landlord. This was something with teeth. Something that had known her name before she'd owned the place a full day, which meant they'd been watching the auction, which meant they'd wanted this building all along and had let it slip through their fingers for $1. And men like that don't forgive a mistake. They correct it. "I have a receipt," Marion said. "I have a key. I paid the county. It's mine." $1. DeLand smiled that smile. "For $1, Mrs. Vance, we can make this very simple. My clients will pay you $5,000 for the inconvenience. Tonight. Cash. You sign a release, you keep the money, and you walk away from a drafty old building you have no earthly use for." Now, Marion had learned a thing or two in 68 years, and the thing she learned right then was this. Nobody offers a broke old woman $5,000 for a building they say is already theirs. You don't pay for something you already own. He wasn't buying the building. He was buying whatever was inside it. "I'll think about it," she said, and she shut the door in his face. He didn't knock again. She heard the car doors, the engine, the tires. But before the headlights swung away, they lit up the room one last time, and she saw the second man had come right up to the window and was cupping his hands against the glass, looking in. Looking at the floor. Marion's blood went cold. She threw the deadbolt and dragged the counter stool against the door, for all the good it would do. She stood there in the dark a long minute, one hand pressed flat against the wood, listening, her heart going like a hammer. And she understood, standing there, that she'd stopped being a widow with a lucky $1. She'd become something in somebody's way. Then she got down on her knees and she found the second board. It came up easier than the first. And there it was, the tin strongbox, and now she understood the lock didn't matter because taped to the bottom, wrapped in the same oilcloth, was a small iron key. Cora had left her the key to everything. Marion fitted in the lock. It turned. She lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in soft cloth, were coins. Gold coins, dozens of them, stacked in paper rolls gone soft with age, each one stamped with an eagle. Beneath them, a fat envelope of banknotes, old bills, and beneath that, a folder of stiff certificates with ornate borders. Railroad bonds. Bearer bonds, the kind that belong to whoever holds them. And under all of it, folded in quarters, a single sheet of heavy paper with a red seal in the corner. A deed. A property deed in the name of Cora Aldridge. Marion Vance sat on the floor of that little building and she pressed both hands to her mouth, and she didn't know whether to laugh or weep, so she did a little of both. If you're still with me, and I hope you are, do me one small favor. Hit that subscribe button. Because what Marion read on that deed is where this whole thing cracks wide open, and you are not going to believe how it ends. Because the deed was not for the Switchboard building. Marion unfolded it with trembling fingers and held it to the lantern. It described the telephone exchange, yes, but it described a great deal more than that. It described the entire depot parcel, the old station grounds, the rail yard, 4 square blocks of Cedar Junction, all of it deeded free and clear to Cora Aldridge in the year 1949, purchased outright, every acre paid for, 4 blocks of a dead town. Which didn't sound like much, until Marion remembered what the man in the coat had said, Cascade Ridge Partners. And until she remembered the flyers that had been going around town all spring, the ones about the new rail trail, the scenic railway they wanted to bring back for the tourists, the developers buying up the old depot land parcel by parcel for more money than anyone here had seen in a generation. She'd seen those flyers in the diner window and thought nothing of it, the way you think nothing of news that has nothing to do with you. She'd been wrong about that too. It had everything to do with her. It just hadn't known her name yet. They needed the depot land, all of it. And the biggest piece, the piece that connected all the others, the piece they could not build their project without, had belonged to a night telephone operator for 70 years. And it had just passed for $1 to the widow they'd left standing on a porch. That was the first development. Here's the second, and it was the one that broke Marion's heart wide open. She read the letters, all of them that whole night in order by lantern light, until the sky went gray. Cora Aldridge had been a young woman during the war. She'd fallen in love with a railroad man named Thomas, and Thomas had money, family money, and Thomas had been killed in France before they could marry. But Cora was already carrying his child, and in that town in those years, an unmarried girl carrying a dead man's baby was a scandal her family would not survive. So Cora's people did what people did then. They sent the baby away to be raised by cousins 2 states over, and they told Cora she could keep her job and her good name, or she could keep the child, but not both. Cora let them take her daughter, and she spent the rest of her life regretting it. The daughter's name, the letters said, was Ruth. Marion's hands went still, because Ruth was her mother's name. Ruth, who never spoke of family. Ruth, who died believing she'd been given away by people who didn't want her. Cora had used Thomas's money to buy the depot land quietly, over years, a piece at a time, holding it, waiting. She never spent $1 on herself. She lived in rented rooms and worked the switchboard and put every cent into that land and that strongbox, all of it, for one reason. So that someday, when the shame was long dead and buried with the people who'd caused it, her grandchild could come home to something. Could come home to proof that she'd been loved all along. I could not reach Ruth, the last letter said. She was raised to hate the name Aldridge, and I could not undo it before I died. But Ruth wrote me once one letter, the only one, to tell me she was expecting a child of her own. And she told me that if the child was a girl, she meant to name her after her own grandmother, a woman named Marion, whom she'd heard of only in stories. So I have addressed all of this to you, my Marion, before you are even born, and I have hidden it where only family would think to look, under the floor where the cat sleeps warmest, and I have prayed every night of my life that one day you would find your way home to this room. Everything here is yours. It was always yours. Forgive an old woman who loved you before you drew breath. Marion put the letter down, and she wept the way you weep when you finally understand you were never unwanted, only lost. She did not sleep. She sat in Cora's chair as the sun came up over Depot Street, holding a photograph she'd found at the bottom of the box, a young woman with Marion's own eyes, standing proud in front of a switchboard in a room Marion now knew as well as her own hands. But there was still the man in the coat, and men like that do not go home and forget. They came back at 9 in the morning, and this time there were 3 of them, and one was a lawyer. DeLand did the talking, the way his kind always do. He stood in the middle of the room Marion had swept clean, and he laid papers on the counter, and he talked about the clerical error again, about how the county's own attorney would confirm the auction was void, about how the reasonable thing, the safe thing, was to take the money and go. He'd raised the offer, $10,000 now. He said the number like it was a mountain of gold, like it should have knocked her flat. Marion listened to all of it. Then she set the deed down on the counter next to his papers. "Read that," she said. DeLand read it, and Marion watched his face do something remarkable. She watched the smile die. She watched the color leave. Because a lawyer knows a valid deed when he sees one, and he knows what it means when the parcel his clients have spent 2 years, and a fortune trying to assemble turns out to have been owned, whole and clear, by one family for 70 years. Their contract with the county was for land the county did not own and never had. Cora had made sure of it. Every tax on that land had been paid in advance, decades in advance, through an account Cora set up with a lawyer in Denver, the same lawyer whose name was written on the inside of the deed folder. That was why the county's records were such a mess. That was why they'd auctioned a building for $1 without knowing what sat under it. "This is not possible," Deland said. "It's mine," Marion said, "same as it was hers." "And I am not for sale, Mr. Deland. Neither is she." He tried everything after that. He threatened. He offered 50,000, then 100, the numbers climbing until they lost all meaning in that dusty little room. He said the deed would never hold up, that she couldn't prove she was any relation to Cora Aldridge, that she was a broke old woman with a cat and a fairy tale. And that was his mistake, because Marion had proof. She had Cora's letters and Cora's photograph, and she had her own mother Ruth's name written in Cora's hand 70 years before, and she had the letter Ruth herself had sent, the one Cora saved, in Ruth's handwriting, announcing the child she'd named Marion. A chain of hands reaching all the way down to the woman standing in that room. She took all of it to the lawyer in Denver whose name was in the folder, an old firm, 3 generations now, and they had been holding a file on the Aldridge estate for 70 years, waiting, the instructions unopened, in case anyone ever came. The senior partner was an old man himself. He wept a little when Marion laid the letters on his desk. He said his grandfather had taken Cora's case as a young man and had told his son, and his son had told him, that someday a woman named Marion might walk in, and if she did, they were to give her everything and ask for nothing. The deed held. Of course it held. Cora had built it to hold. Cascade Ridge Partners could not build their railway without the depot land, and the depot land was Marion's, all 4 blocks of it. They did not buy it from her cheap. In the end, they did not buy it at all. They leased it on Marion's terms drawn up by the old firm in Denver, for a sum of money that a woman who'd slept in a bus shelter 3 days before could not have imagined in her wildest dreams. And the gold and the bonds, when the same firm sorted through them, came to more than the money. Cora had chosen well and waited long, and it had all grown, quiet under a floorboard for 70 patient years. Marion Vance was not broke anymore, but that in the end was the smallest part of it. The trains came back to Cedar Junction the next spring, not the freight trains. The scenic ones, the tourist railway Cascade built along the old line, and it brought people to that dying town for the first time in 40 years. The storefronts started filling again, slow, one at a time. And right in the middle of it all on Depot Street stood the old telephone exchange, cleaned and repaired and painted, the faded sign restored. Marion did not sell it. She could have bought a fine house anywhere. Instead, she moved a proper bed into the back room, and she kept the front just as it was, the switchboard and all, the operator's chair by the window. She opened it up as a little museum, free to anyone who wanted to come in. She'd sit in Cora's chair and tell folks how it used to work, how a voice would come down the line, and a woman would sit right here through the long nights and connect it to another voice somewhere out in the dark. How for 31 years this room was where the whole town came together, one call at a time. She hung Cora's photograph on the wall, the young woman with Marion's eyes, and beside it she hung the letter, the first one, in a simple frame. For Marion, if you are reading this, then you have come home at last. People would read it and go quiet. Some of them cried, standing there in that little room. Marion understood. It wasn't really about the money or the land or the deed. It was about the thing everybody carries and almost nobody says out loud. The fear that we come from nobody, that we belong to no one, that if we vanished, there'd be no hand reaching down through the years to call us back by name. Cora had spent her whole life making sure that would not be true for the granddaughter she never held. She lived small and lonely and full of regret so that 70 years later, a woman with 2 suitcases and nowhere to go would push open a stuck door and find out she'd been loved all along. Marion lived a long time after that, longer than the doctors would have guessed, the way people do when they finally have a reason. Dobbin, the arthritic old cat who'd pawed up that first warped board, lived out his days sleeping in a patch of sun on the floor, right over the spot where the strongbox had been, where the cat sleeps warmest. Marion never moved him from it. She'd just smile and let him be. And sometimes late, when the tourists were gone and the street was quiet, Marion would sit in Cora's chair by the window and think about that morning on the courthouse steps, about the hand that shoved her out a door and thought it was throwing away nothing, about how the worst day of her life had walked her, step by step, to the only place on earth that had ever truly been meant for her. She'd think about her grandmother sitting in this same chair through 31 years of long nights, waiting for a granddaughter to come home. And she'd reach over and touch the frame on the wall, the brown ink, the careful slanted hand. "I'm here," she'd say soft to the empty room. "I made it home." And outside, down the tracks, you could just hear the last train of the evening, slowing down, finally, after all these years, to stop in Cedar Junction.